propose to share my time with Deputy Eamon Scanlon, please.
Great.
That's great. Minister, thanks for outlining the bill, and as you know, we've waited quite some time for this. And effectively, when we look at it, is the rental sector, and certainly the legislation that governs it, does require reform, and I think all of us across the House need that. We want to see tenants' rights strengthened. So in that regard, I very much welcome the proposed extension of the notice periods and the additional powers given to the Residential Tenancies Board, which are overdue, and I'm pleased to see it. So in broad terms, we will be supporting this bill. There are elements which I will cover now as well that I think we'll have to look at committee and to go through this in some more detail. I still have a general concern about the over-reliance on the courts. I know and really I think one of the biggest issues is that when a determination is made by the RTB, and whilst we give them the additional powers that most of us actually want them to have, it still requires effectively to effect that determination in the main is recourse to the circuit court, and that's where there's been a lot of the blockages and the delays have been held there. I still think, I don't know, maybe we can expand further at committee as to the advice that you got there. I know we did discuss, and Deputy O'Brien and myself discussed with you as well, the whole area of the criminal sanction, and that if it was a civil sanction, would it be actually make the process actually easier, so we would not have to have recourse to the courts all the time. So that actually certainly remains a concern. But I suppose these revised legislation or these revised regulations are coming in when we are in the midst of a rental crisis, where we do see insecurity within the market, and effectively what we want to see in Fianna Fáil is improved tenant security for tenants, but increased supply. So I suppose as well there is a balance for us to strike here, is that regulation and legislation that's brought in doesn't impact negatively on supply. My understanding from figures of last year that we did about 6,000 of those individual landlords that you referred to, and the vast majority of landlords are individuals with one or two properties, have continued to leave the market, and that in itself is driving rents up in many places. So we need to look at the supply, and that's why the cost rental model and why the rollout of that scheme is crucially important, to try to look at what works in other parts of Europe and to try to diversify our rental market. Like when we look at rents here in Ireland, we're looking at they're about 36% higher than they were at the height of the previous boom, where we see people, and you've alluded to them in your opening remarks as well, who are paying, you know, 500, 600, 700 euro more in rental payments than they would be paying in mortgage payments if they were able to actually get that mortgage and buy that house. And that's one of the things, was you mentioned in your remarks to the House here today about the reason why, some of the reasons why you believe that people are continuing to rent longer is down to maybe getting married later in life, to travelling, to changes in lifestyles, and that I think a lot of it is actually down to that they can't afford to buy a home. Fundamentally, and I'm sure many colleagues are well aware of people in our own constituencies all across the country that when they've been fortunate enough to be able to save and to manage to do that, that they save themselves hundreds of euro a month in paying a mortgage versus paying rent. So we do need that review of the RPZs. I think the RPZs in the main, they have worked to a degree, but they are imperfect. So that proper review needs to happen. It needs to look at areas that are outside the RPZs as well. It needs to look at people who are caught in it. It needs to look at the exemptions within the RPZs for new properties. But in the main, I would welcome what is here in the bill. But I think you have also mentioned, Minister, that there are two very significant areas that are not in this bill that you're looking to bring forward at committee. And obviously the support that we give to this bill, not saying it's conditional, but we want to ensure that particularly the purpose-built student accommodation is included in the RPZs. And I've previously given you a definition, both ourselves and I know Sinn Féin have published legislation in this regard. So that's something that I would definitely want to see at committee stage. And you know, we met you over the course of the summer on this as well. I think if we can get advance notice and advance sight of what those amendments are, so that they're not just brought to committee, that we don't have to be in a position whereby I don't want to be disagreeing with you. Indeed, I think all of us recognise that many of these changes are needed. So I believe between ourselves, Labour, Sinn Féin and others, that we can actually work together to get those amendments, the amendments particularly around the purpose-built student accommodation, to make sure that we don't have students gouged in the new academic year, because this legislation really has to be passed and clear both houses before the summer. And I would give you the commitment from Fianna Fáil that we would work and will work constructively to ensure the passage of this bill in the Dáil and indeed in the Seanad, and is done speedily. But we need to see the student accommodation element covered, and also very clearly the transparency is really important. So the rent price register, I'd be interested as to hear what I know that you're getting legal advice on that, and I'm just wondering what the nature of that is. I wouldn't have thought that it would be that problematic. Hopefully it's not, and you might in your closing remarks be able to enlighten us on that, because I think transparency is something that, and price transparency, will definitely help within the market and will help with the data that your department and the RTB themselves are holding. I also wanted just to mention to you, and we need to interrogate this a bit further, is the annual registration, about how, one, that is going to affect price potentially, but two, also in relation to any future administrative burden on the RTB. So that's something that I'd like to return to at committee to see how in real terms that will actually work. And I think that's important. I know that there's a balance to be struck between additional powers to the RTB and tying them up in red tape as well. You've seen quite a substantial increase, over 5,000 complaints, I think you mentioned in your speech here, or investigations, individual ones being carried out by the RTB. So I think the other piece for us to do as a housing committee is to ensure that the RTB are properly resourced to actually carry out the additional functions and powers that we're potentially giving them in this piece of legislation. So in that regard, I'd like, and maybe not for today, but when the bill comes back to committee, that we could see what plans there are to expand the RTB itself, what additional funding is required to do that, what additional staff indeed is required for them to carry out their new duties that they have here. I do think there are other things that are needed, and I know you've mentioned that there will be another rent bill coming forward, and a rent reform bill. But when we look at things like a national rent deposit scheme, which Fianna Fáil have called for and others have called for, I think that's really important. I think the local authority quality certificate, I think we do need to look at tax treatment as well. I think we need to make sure that we keep landlords in the market, good landlords in the market, because it is part of our housing solution. And then we need to see how we can move forward together to ensure the speedy implementation of the cost rental model. So, you know, when I look at the legislation, I suppose my big concern is the over-reliance on the courts still. Now, there may be, I think you mentioned this at committee as well, that the criminal sanction is required. But I have a grave concern that at every stage that we're looking at going to the courts to implement determinations, and that one has an effect in clogging up the courts, but two, prolongs a lot of these judgments being implemented. I do think as well, and it may not be for this bill, because this bill is published in the context of looking at current abuses in the market, particularly from the landlord sector. There are other things to be looked at as well, though, mind you, about third-party complaints, about antisocial behaviour, about about the role and responsibility of tenants as well. And I think that can be looked at maybe potentially into the future. But certainly colleagues already have said to me that what they would like to see, which is very clear in the bill, how complaints are made and how they're worked through, that someone who's deemed to be affected may not always be a landlord or a tenant, it may indeed be a neighbour. And I think that I firmly believe that we need to actually look at mechanisms whereby other complaints, and valid ones, can be made. And the RTB can make a determination as to whether they're spurious or not. But in many instances, communities can be affected by bad landlords, and in some instances as well by bad tenants. But to conclude, we would broadly welcome this piece of legislation. I think it is an improvement. It certainly adds to what we have. Does it do everything that we want? No, it doesn't. But as I said, Minister, I certainly will give you a commitment on behalf of Fianna Fáil that we will work speedily to improve this bill as well at committee. We are looking at potential amendments as well. I'm sure other colleagues are too. But I would ask you that give us early sight of the student purpose-built student accommodation amendments as soon as you can, and also the price register amendments. I think it would allow an easier passage of those amendments at committee. But as I said, in broad terms, we will certainly support this bill, as we see it as an important measure towards strengthening tenants' rights, improving the process, giving additional powers that are badly needed to the Residential Tenancies Board as well.